Thank you for joining me on this week's Homeowners Be Aware podcast. How aware are you regarding where your house is located and the chances you might experience flooding? Every year when we have big storms, we see an incredible amount of flood damage. It's estimated flooding accounts for about 60% of all storm damages, so you'd think we'd seen enough of this and that we'd be doing more to stop it from happening. But statistics don't lie. We are not doing enough. You are going to learn a lot about flooding and flood prevention today from my guest, J Paul Abrams, otherwise known as the Flood Stud. J Paul has advice we all need to know about. I'm George Siegel, and this is Homeowners Be Aware, the podcast that teaches you everything you need to know about being a homeowner. J Paul, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, I got to ask you this before we get started. I have a million questions I want to ask you, but you can't just let something like this go by. Why are you called the Flood Stud?
Well, it started with a code official from New Jersey. He was actually the ICC president for the International Code Council. And he started coming to all these conferences and he'd say, "Where's the Flood Stud?" And so it kind of stuck. And so now I have people all across the country that actually refer to me as the Flood Stud or ask if I can come speak. And I sit on several building officials code boards, and they all refer to me as the Flood Stud.
That's kind of cool. Now, when I first heard that, and this kind of dates myself, I was thinking back to one of those war correspondents. I think his name was Arthur Kent, and he was wasn't he the Scud Stud because they were shooting Scud missiles at him?
Scud missiles, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so that was his nickname. So you're in pretty cool company, I guess, if you can land a nickname like that.
I guess so.
now, what we keep finding out, storm after storm, event after event, is that flooding is a major problem. I think it's the leading cause of deaths in storms. You would know that better than me. But flooding is a major issue. Why do you think it's almost like people are waking up to it, but they haven't already taken it seriously? Why is that?
Right. It's funny because when I'm on the West Coast, they say, "Oh, we don't get rain, so we don't flood." Well, guess what? Las Vegas has flooded at least 3 times in the past few years. A lot of it has to do with we're building houses on top of houses, and there's nowhere for the water to go. And so, you see these homes and people are flooding and don't know what to do with it. So a lot of it has to do with municipalities and tax base and that type of stuff.
You think people just have no idea to even ask those questions? I know here in Florida, I was just absolutely stunned to hear that a seller does not have to disclose to a buyer if their house is flooded before. So what I was telling people is you should ask that question, then put them on the spot and say, has this house ever had a water issue before? Why would something like that not just be obvious and everybody have to do it?
It should be. And I don't know what Florida real estate laws are, but in a lot of the states now, they're having to disclose that. And even when they go to sell a house, the realtor, if you go to like realtor.com, there's actually a form that they have to fill out and disclosing all that. And, how much the flood insurance is going to be before the homeowner, the new happy homeowner, goes and sits down in front of a lawyer to sign his life away and finds out that his flood insurance is $30,000 a year. So it should be disclosed. Like I said, I've not looked at Florida's real estate laws, but common sense tells you, if you live near water, or in low-lying areas close to water, you're probably going to flood eventually. Look at Vegas.
Exactly. And while common sense may say that, I that's why I tell people, ask them the question, make them put it in writing that it's never happened before. Because if you wait for that law to actually change, there is a form that realtors have, but they don't have to give it to the buyer unless the buyer asks for it. And I think that's absolutely crazy. I was looking at some statistics of which states have the most floods and why. And the top 5 are Texas, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Florida, and then California comes in number 5. Every place has their own reasons for why there is flooding, the dynamics of it. As a consumer, what can we do to improve our chances that it doesn't happen to us?
Well, those areas that you were talking about are pretty well populated areas. And like I said earlier, we're kind of our worst enemy. We build houses on top of houses because, one, the municipalities are looking for that tax base, but it also, there's nowhere for the water to go. So, my honest opinion is that we need to ask those questions those areas, they're all low-lying areas. Think Texas, Louisiana, California, Vegas, those areas on the West Coast really don't have any dynamics because they don't think it rains there, but they still have to build a flood compliancy. Their insurance is through the roof in these areas, even Florida.
Yeah, nobody ever cries for Vegas if they have problems, but all those other places, people feel pretty bad about. There's a gentleman I had on my podcast several months ago who lived in Tin City, in Naples, where there was flooding from Ian. It's a neighborhood where there's 20 homes in this neighborhood, and they all had flood damage. They all had to rebuild and repair their homes, but nothing changed in how they had to do that. That seems kind of crazy to me.
It does. And now that the International Code Council, who actually writes the code books for all 50 states, now municipalities like North Carolina and Louisiana can make addendums to those codes, but they still have to follow the FEMA guidelines. And those guidelines are now in the ICC code books, IRC, which is your residential, IBC, which is commercial, and then ASCE 24 or ASCE, which is the engineer guide. All these flood things that we see and talk about are all in those books and should be enforced by your code officials.
Yeah, you would think, and to me, that would be an interesting case study. Could you put a barrier around a community? I mean, what do you do if you're right by the water and there's really not much you can do? You can't build up out into the water. You don't have the ability to do that. How could somebody with a house right by the water protect themselves, or are they just rolling the dice?
Well, hopefully, because a lot of areas, especially Florida and the Carolinas, where I'm from, we build houses on slabs, and those slabs pretty much you're putting the homeowners in harm's way. So if you live on the water, the best thing to do is elevate the house, lift that house. You should put, when you do the enclosures or lift the house, you should put the proper certified engineered flood vents in those homes. So they work like they should, not an air vent, but a certified flood vent. But really and truly, barriers, you would have to get a special ordinance from the municipality. FEMA says we don't dry flood-proof homes. So in other words, barriers that go around these things, you're really diverting that water on somebody else's property. And, think about me and you. I've got a house, I put a barrier around there, and now your house floods because of what I did. You probably wouldn't be too kind to me. So FEMA regulations say no dry flood proofing on properties.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting because I would think you would be able to just keep the water off of your property, but I can certainly understand the reasoning behind not doing that. It's also very difficult, which happens a lot in Florida, when you have insurance and then you have a claim. The insurance and the flood insurance then fight over seeing who gets stuck having to pay you. So the victim is kind of victimized twice. Now they have to be in the middle of that fight. How can they make that easier on themselves? Or is, again, nothing you can do?
Well, flood insurance is totally different than property homeowners insurance. Government, FEMA NFIP program regulates that insurance to make sure that people are being honest with it. And so you can buy that insurance through private sectors. We actually own an insurance company that does nothing but flood insurance all across the country. And what we do is actually look for those homes that can be mitigated, because at that time you're a lower risk. And so the insurance companies will actually work with you. Some give discounts by mitigating your home. So that really and truly, like I said, if you're filing insurance, it should be through, if it's flood, it should be through FEMA. Or if you've got private insurance, like with State Farm or Allstate, it would be a flood insurance policy. And that's what pays out. Your homeowner's insurance doesn't pay out in flood.
Yeah, I was just hearing about how the insurance company was trying to say that the flood program is responsible for taking care of it. So both sides battle, and then the homeowner could go months without being able to have anything done because you're kind of caught in between two parties.
Well, I just had somebody reach out to me last week, and what they're saying is FEMA's not been down there to help these citizens yet. And you got to remember what's going on. A lot of FEMA was deployed over to Hawaii, and so resources don't get out there as fast as we would like them to. So, a lot of times you've got to be able to work you've got to work the system. My father was actually in a little town called Lumberton, North Carolina. Closest water to his house was a big old water tower on I-95, and he flooded twice because the dam broke and flooded the whole city. Luckily, he had flood insurance and didn't realize it until somebody called and said, "Hey, you want to file a claim?" So a lot of times we have to kind of pay attention to what's going on, and maybe you have to reach out to FEMA. There's a lot of online and phone numbers that we can reach out to.
Sure. Once you're a victim, nothing's ever fast enough because
No,
your life is just turned upside down. Now, Tom Little
absolutely
was featured in my documentary film, The Last House Standing, and he pointed out how in Hurricane Harvey,
right.
so many people could have been on a better path to recovery if they had flood insurance
Right.
because they weren't living in a flood zone and they didn't realize how inexpensive it was. That word really needs to get out to people who aren't in flood zones, doesn't it?
Well, when I do presentations, whether it be through a community or a municipality, I always bring my cell phone. Can't see it here, but I bring my cell phone and I say, we'll insure our cell phones, but we don't insure the most valuable asset we own. Basic flood insurance runs about $300, $350 just for base flood. So those people that were in Texas, they lived on houses, on slabs, and they lived in areas that weren't deemed flood areas. But when the levees broke, guess where the water went? It went to those homes, and those people were not paying flood insurance, so they didn't have anybody that could help them. But I always remember, you'll insure that cell phone, but why wouldn't you, your biggest asset, why wouldn't you insure that? So,
and that's one of the things I say with my podcast. It's the biggest investment you have. Why don't you know more? And you want to just scream at people and say, this is so important. Why do you not know more? They probably know more about the safety features in their car. They do take better care of that cell phone. People probably spend more money grooming themselves, but the investment that they put hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in, they're just assuming is okay.
Yeah. Like I said, the dogs, we pamper our 3 dachshunds like they're children, But you're right. People need to pay attention to what they own because it's their insurance policy for later in life. My wife and I are getting close to retirement age, and first thing we thought of is we got to have a house that's paid for because that could be her retirement after I've passed or mine, whichever. So homes are important, and we should take care of it and know more. You're right.
Come on, we don't want to hear about the flood stud retiring anytime soon.
No time soon.
So when a storm is coming, one of the things people need to know is obviously what their zone is, how safe they are, and whether or not they need to evacuate. If you're in an area that even has the slightest risk of storm surge, what do you tell people?
Well, there are things that you can do to your home. I mean, there are barriers. We have one that's called Damn Easy, and it actually goes in the doorway of your home. You open the door, set it down, jack the sides out, and it keeps water from coming in through those doors. Making sure, I mean, sandbags are available. They don't always work. And the sad part about those is after they're wet, nobody wants them. But taking things high and keep it high and dry, as I say, even if it means taking a TV and putting it on top of a dresser, things that you can't carry out of the home with you, at least try to do what you can to prevent those damages because your insurance may not cover that TV that you had. So you just be prepared. I'm an Eagle Scout. I say be prepared.
One of the saddest things I saw from Idalia, the hurricane that we just had, some houses in my neighborhood did flood, but the neighbors that left because they were worried about the surge, they didn't even put the sandbags they had out correctly. They would have like 3 piled here, 3 piled next to them, and there was no barrier that was built to protect the water or slow it down from coming in.
Right.
Why would you take the time to throw a sandbag out and not know how to throw a sandbag out?
I went to Miami back a few years ago, and they had a storm, and what they did was the bank was sitting on a corner. They had stop logs around the 2 sides, but they never came back and did anything with the doorway because they had customers coming in and out. And I guess the guys that set it up got busy doing something else. And so the side barriers didn't even work, didn't even need water over there. All of it went through the door and it flooded the bank. So, that people just don't stop and think. And I guess it's some like me, ADHD, I'll start something and run off to something else. But, you got to make sure that you're covering those main assets. those
Yeah,
entryways.
that's what happens when we get old. We always quickly go on to something else. Now, as we were walking around the neighborhood the day after the storm, the Serve Pro guys were out. They were at three houses that had all flooded, three houses in a row. And the guy said, yeah, they all got about 6 to 10 inches of water in them. And I said, that's going to be a mess, isn't it? And he said, everything is lost. That's within that range. All the carpeting, the furniture, it wicks up into the walls. Describe to people how bad it is with just a little bit of water in your house.
Well, it doesn't take much to ruin. I mean, 1 inch of water in staying in a house, your carpet, your pads, your flooring system, the sheetrock in your home actually absorbs that. The insulation back behind that sheetrock gets all wet, and if you don't tend to it, the wood even will mildew. So water's pretty bad. And you started off. There's more property damage to flood than there is actually fires. You think about the fires we have in California, but just think about what we did in Fort Myers or Tampa. I mean, you lose a lot of homes, and it costs a lot of money.
One of the saddest sights I can remember when I lived in Detroit, when the rivers would flood every year and people's houses would flood, some of them would set their house on fire, hoping that it was seen as a fire and not a flood, because they had coverage for that. And the desperation people feel when something bad is happening just leads you to make bad decisions, doesn't it?
Right. Yes, sir. I wouldn't set fire to anything. Fire to me is so permanent. That's the word I'm looking for. So permanent. Flood, you can recover from it. You think it's a loss, but fire, everything's gone. You can salvage pictures and things like that in a flood. So
now the builder of our house had put those crummy screen vents on the garage, and of course, because I know people that are in the flooding business, I was told how stupid that was. And so we have flood vents on our garage. But in a sense, you are conceding the garage. So if you know there's going to be flooding, there's probably a lot of things you want to get out of there.
Right. And you mentioned the flood vents. Flood vents do relieve the hydrostatic pressure that would build up on that foundation, and even in garages, those enclosures. So those vents actually open to allow that water and debris to pass through, and then bi-directional. So we're moving the water around within that house. But yeah, you're right. I mean, garages, we got motorcycles and toys in the garage. I would do everything I could to keep that water out, or if not, take things high and dry. I'd roll the motorcycle inside the house, take it upstairs and put it in the bedroom or something. So.
And if you have an electric car, I'd be scared to death of what would happen if that got in water. I mean, we've heard some bad stories about that.
Yeah. Water and electricity don't go well together. We had a video at one time that showed Con Edison over in New York, and during Sandy, the power plant actually shorted out and there were sparks, but everybody was standing out in the water in the streets. And you're like, geez, water can travel, or electricity travel through the water, and it wouldn't be good for them. I know they're happy and celebrate, but that's just crazy.
I know. Now, why do you think deaths from flooding have increased so much? If we're getting the word out, if we're telling people, don't drive through water, don't stay if you're going to have a storm surge, because most people don't survive a storm surge. Yet deaths have soared over the last several years in that category. Why is that?
Yeah, well, people don't want to leave their belongings. They've seen things on TV where, houses have been looted and businesses have been looted. And some people stay around to protect their personal things, which is crazy. You can replace those things, but you can't replace mom, dad, or the kid, and so driving's the same thing. We think we've got big pickup trucks and we drive through the water thinking it's all cool, but you don't know if that road's washed out beneath that water, and people fall down in those or get swept away with water. So a lot of it's just, I hate to say it, but stupidity. I mean, we don't think about what could happen.
Yep. So what would you suggest a family do to make sure that they have the best plan? What's a good... And I tell people, don't wait until the hurricane is approaching you and then sit there and try to think about what you could do. When that's getting really close, as I've learned, as I'm not I wasn't born in Florida, when it gets really close, your brain just doesn't work the same way. You don't, if you had to grab things and get out of your house and someone said you have 10 minutes to do it, most people would take 9 minutes to figure out what they wanted to get, and then they'd have a minute left. So it's tough. You don't want to wait till the last minute.
Well, I don't know. Elementary school for me, we were taught, stop, drop, and roll, and during the earthquakes or hurricanes, and even that civil preparedness that we used to go through. You have a plan. You go ahead and map that plan out today, and it's a shame that a small kid comes home and says, "Let's make a fire plan." You should plan out those things, and maybe have a tote that you can carry, a plastic tote with things like blankets or food, just in case something does happen. You have to stay somewhere a longer period, but just prepare and don't wait for the storm.
And, I like to think that I'm somewhat prepared because of this podcast and the films that I've made. But I had a guy on who makes a fire ladder, and the fire ladder for second stories is an entire ladder that folds against the side of the house and then it flips out. Brilliant product. And it just, you don't even notice it when it's folded against the house, but you can climb out. And what he asked me is, do you have one of those rope ladders, the kind that unbunches when you throw it out the window? And I said, yeah. He goes, have you ever used it? And I go, no. Do you know what it would be like in a fire to throw a loose ladder out a window and try to climb down it and never have practiced that? That to me, and I don't do it. I bet most people have never practiced that kind of stuff.
And you see a lot of these homes that have them. I used to be a volunteer fireman, and people would use those things. But what happens if the fire starts downstairs in the living room? You drop that ladder, you're going to get burned. So, it doesn't make good sense to me. I mean, you just have to be prepared. And that ladder that you're talking about, I've seen those, and they are pretty slick. I mean, you don't see them until you need them, but most of us don't know how to climb down a rope ladder.
Exactly. But the solid one, you could at least practice. I mean, I saw a video of a family practicing that, because you wouldn't have the first idea how to climb out a window. At least most people wouldn't. I bet kids do when they're sneaking out of the house. But as far as us grown-ups, I've never tried anything like that. I wouldn't want to have to do that at a last minute. And then as far as grabbing things, we learned from the fire in Malibu, one of the residents there suggested having a go box with a list in it. So if you had to make a plan at the last second to grab things, it would say, grab the passports, grab a picture of grandpa, grab baby shoes.
Right.
At least you don't have to think of it then. You just do it.
Yeah. Funny story. We had a storm in Wilmington, North Carolina, and one of my friends gathered up all the guns and all the wedding pictures and all this and put it in his truck, and they headed north. They left Wilmington, North Carolina to Raleigh, North Carolina. And we probably had a pine cone fall off a tree, but where they were staying, it flooded. An entire truck was underwater. And, we have clay in North Carolina. So everything was orange, the wedding pictures, the guns. And I say, you never go north of the storm. You always go south.
Well, inevitably, there were people here in Tampa last year that when Ian was coming, we were told it was coming here. They went down to Fort Myers, or they went to Orlando. Those were the two places that Ian hit. And then this year, people went north with the Dahlia, and that's where the storm ended up going as well. I think the news media is doing a really good job lately, because what they're telling people is you don't have to go 100 miles. If you go 10 miles away from your house, you might be at someplace safe, and then you could get back quicker. But you don't need to caravan to Tennessee or anything, because you're probably going much further than you have to.
Right. And I think that the message was during that storm was go somewhere higher. And the safest place to go is a shelter, where the government has actually said, we've opened the school. Usually those places are safe. Now, don't go to a football stadium that's in a swimming pool. You might get flooded. You never know. But usually the municipalities have planned this, and they know where to send their citizens. And this year, that storm, the message was, you don't have to leave the state. You can just go to a higher area. And two, you can get back. I say that's what we want to do. We want to get back home to make sure they're safe.
It's always sad when you hear the stories after a storm of people that left their pets behind. I couldn't leave my pet behind, or our dogs behind, for anything. But I was getting his shots last week. He was getting his vaccines, and they said, this is important that you have a record of this, because if you had to go to a shelter with your dog, they won't let you in unless you can show the dog is fully vaccinated. So that's another thing people need to think about.
Right. Like I said, you have to plan out. You think about this stuff. And that's one thing that I wouldn't even have thought of, unless I knew I was going to go to a shelter. I probably wouldn't have got the dog's papers and carried with me. So that's a good thought.
I can't for the life of me
imagine.
I can't imagine the look on my dog's face if I was leaving him in a storm, because he looks at me like that when I'm just going to take the mail out or something.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be happily married if I left my 3 dachshunds behind. So
sure, my wife would leave me behind before the dogs. She'd say, "Hey, George, you stay here, but I'm taking those dogs because they're far more hard to replace." So let's get some final words of advice for people that you would say. Give me your best flood advice. I know you've probably given it already, but I think we could tell people 100 times and they would still go, "Huh? What'd you tell me?"
And that's the sad part, but the fun part of my job is that I get to talk to municipalities and tell them what they can do to help save their citizens in their city. But the biggest thing is education. Ask those questions, like you said, George. I mean, if I'm buying a new house and the word flood is anywhere in the mortgage, I'm going to ask, do I need flood insurance? How much is that flood insurance going to be? Is the house compliant? And that's the thing that realtors probably aren't to look at when they list a home. They need to make sure that they know that house is compliant or what it needs to be so it is compliant, because there's nothing worse than going to buy a house, happy day, and then you find out your flood insurance is, like I said, $30,000 a year. I mean, that ruins it for the homeowner. And I'd back out and run too. So, but I'd really say education, ask those questions. The municipalities need to be taking a little bit more harder look at being compliant. Just the simple thing, using the right vent, not an air vent, but an engineered flood vent in homes that are in flood areas. And tell them about barriers, things that you can do, like protect a garage or an entry door, but you can't put the super balloon around the house because it's not, FEMA doesn't like that. Okay. So,
well, if they don't like it, then we better not do it. It's so impressive here when I see what the city does, and I see it around Florida, to prepare to help people after the storm. Wouldn't it be great if we could do more to prepare people before the storm?
Well, we used to say, let's mitigate after the storm. We want to mitigate where we be ready for the next one. I say we mitigate today before the storm. There's things that you can do to your house that's very simple, like put those flood vents in there. You reduce your flood insurance just by putting the engineered openings in there. So, yeah, we should mitigate before the storm.
I wish I could come up with some more things to reduce my insurance, because as a Floridian now, wow, we get tattooed.
Yeah. Flood insurance is high, especially all those houses that are on slabs. A few years ago, I went to Clearwater Beach, and there was a lady, and her insurance was about $20,000 a year. And she was a widow, and she wasn't going to be able to make that $20,000 a year payment for flood insurance. And the only option she had was to sell the home for the property, or either raise the house, lift it, because when they built the house, they didn't do surveys. So
what did she end up doing? Do you know?
I don't know. I think she was leaning towards selling the house for the property, because they'd have to bulldoze the house and rebuild a new home. Lifting that house for her probably rather expensive. So,
all right. Well, J Paul Abrams, the flood stud, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. And all your contact information will be in the show notes. Okay. I appreciate your time and all your great information.
Well, anything I can do for you or your listeners, call me up. I'm here.
All right. Thank you. If you have a flooding story or any story, good or bad, about your experience as a homeowner, let me know about it. There's a contact form in the show notes. You might be featured on an upcoming podcast. And if you enjoyed what you were listening to, please become a subscriber so you don't miss an episode. A new one comes out every Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.